After 4 years of marriage, my wife wanted an open marriage. I agreed and took her mother. What happened next will surprise you. She didn't see it coming. Hello. Thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Brenda Raven from Lawport, Indiana. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. I used to think marriage was like a house, solid, dependable, something you could build a life in. For years in, and I started noticing the cracks. Not big ones, not yet, but little hairline fractures in the walls. Elise, my wife, had been distant for months, and I didn't know why. I'd catch her staring out the window, her coffee going cold, like she was somewhere else. I'd ask, "You okay?" And she'd smile, but it was tight, forced, like she was hiding something. I told myself it was just stress. Her graphic design job had been rough, and maybe she needed space. But deep down, I was scared. Scared she was slipping away, and I didn't know how to hold on. That night, we sat at the dining table, the silence between us heavier than the burnt meatloaf on my plate. I tried to cook, thinking it might help, but the smoke alarm had gone off earlier, and now the room smelled like failure. Elise picked at her food, her fork scraping the plate, and I watched her, waiting for something to break the tension. And then she did. "I want an open marriage," she said, her voice steady, like she'd practiced it. She took a sip of wine, casual, like she'd just asked me to pass the salt. I blinked. What? The word came out small, like I wasn't sure I'd heard her right. She set her glass down, her eyes meeting mine for the first time that night. "I feel trapped, Daniel. I need to explore who I am, outside of us. I think it'll make us stronger." I laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was the kind of laugh you let out when you're trying not to cry. Stronger? "Elise, what are you even talking about?" She leaned forward, her hands folding on the table, like she was explaining something simple. "I've been reading about it. Open marriages, polyamory, it's not weird anymore. People do it. It's about freedom, about being honest. I think we need this." I felt my chest tighten, like someone had grabbed my heart and squeezed. "Honest," I said, my voice shaking. "You're telling me this now, after 4 years, and you think it's honest?" Her eyes flickered, just for a second, like she wasn't as sure as she sounded. But then she straightened, and her voice got firmer. "I'm already seeing someone," she said. "His name's Leo. He's an artist. It's not serious, but I need you to know." The room spun. Leo, an artist. Not serious. The words hit me like punches, one after the other. I stared at her, trying to find the woman I'd married, the woman who'd laughed with me on that spontaneous road trip to the coast 4 years ago. We'd gotten lost, ended up at some rundown diner with sticky tables, and she'd teased me about my terrible sense of direction. We'd stayed up all night, talking about everything, our dreams, our fears, the life we wanted to build. That night, she'd looked at me like I was enough. Now, she looked at me like I wasn't. "Daniel," she said, softer now, like she could see I was breaking. "Say something." But I didn't know what to say. My throat felt tight, my hands clenched under the table. "You're already seeing him," I repeated, my voice flat. "How long?" "A few weeks," she said, looking away. "It's not about him. It's about me. I need this." I wanted to yell, to throw the meatloaf across the room, to demand she take it back. But I didn't. Because I loved her. Because even now, sitting there with my heart in pieces, I couldn't imagine losing her. "And if I say no?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought maybe she'd back down. But then she said, "I don't know. I just know I can't keep feeling like this." I looked down at my plate, the meatloaf cold and congealed, and I felt like that meatloaf. Burnt, useless, left behind. "Okay," I said finally, the word tasting like ash. "If that's what you need." Her face softened, and she reached for my hand. "Thank you," she said, like I'd given her a gift. But her touch felt wrong, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I pulled my hand back, stood up, and walked to the kitchen, pretending I needed water. Really, I just needed to breathe. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Elise slept next to me, her breathing slow and even, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I kept imagining her with Leo, this artist, this stranger. Was he funnier than me? More exciting? Did he make her laugh like I used to? My mind spun, and I felt like I was drowning. I grabbed my phone, the screen bright in the dark, and started Googling. Open marriage rules. How to survive an open marriage. The articles were a mess. Some said it was liberating, others said it was a death sentence. One forum had a guy ranting about how his wife left him for her lover. Another had a woman saying it saved her marriage. I read until my eyes burned, but none of it helped. None of it told me how to stop feeling like I wasn't enough. I looked over at Elise, her face peaceful in the moonlight, and I wondered if she even knew what she'd done. She'd opened a door, and I didn't know if I could close it. I didn't know if I wanted to. All I knew was that our house, the one we'd built together, was cracking, and I didn't know how to fix it. I set my phone down, my hands shaking, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come. Instead, I saw that diner from our road trip, the sticky tables, her laugh. And I wondered if we'd ever find our way back, or if we were already lost. I couldn't stop picturing it. Elise with Leo, laughing at some artsy cafe, his paint-stained hands brushing hers, her eyes lighting up like they used to for me. It played in my head like a movie I couldn't turn off, and it hurt. Hurt like a punch to the gut, every time. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my chest tight, and check her side of the bed. She was there, asleep, but it didn't matter. She wasn't mine anymore. Not really. Work was no better. I'd sit at my desk, staring at spreadsheets, but all I could think about was them. Was he funnier than me? More exciting? Did he make her feel alive in ways I couldn't? I tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting, and my coworker, Mike, noticed. "You okay, man?" he asked one day, leaning over my cubicle. "You look like you lost a bet with life." I forced a smile. "Just tired," I said, but he didn't buy it. That night, he dragged me to a happy hour at some noisy bar, all sticky floors and bad music. "You need to loosen up," he said, handing me a beer. I took it, but it tasted sour, like everything else. The guys started talking about their wives, their girlfriends, and I tried to join in, but it felt fake. When I finally told them about Elise, about the open marriage, they laughed. "Just get over it, man," Mike said, clapping my shoulder. "Go find someone else." Even the score. Even the score. The words stuck with me, like gum on a shoe. I didn't want to even the score. I wanted my wife back. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. She'd opened this door, and I was just supposed to sit there, waiting? No. If she could do it, so could I. I didn't know who or how, but I knew I needed to do something. Anything. I kept Googling, late at night, the screen burning my eyes. How to survive an open marriage. Open marriage success stories. The forums were a mess. Some people said it saved their relationships, others said it ruined them. One guy wrote about his wife leaving him for her lover, and I felt my stomach drop. Another woman said it made her feel free, alive. I wanted to feel alive too, but all I felt was dead inside. The articles talked about rules, communication, boundaries, honesty, but we hadn't set any. Elise had just dropped the bomb and left me to deal with the fallout. That weekend, Elise's family had a barbecue. I didn't want to go, but she insisted. "It'll be good for us," she said, like we were still a team. I didn't argue. I just grabbed my jacket and followed her out the door, my jaw tight. The backyard was full of people, her brother Todd, her sister Claire, cousins I barely knew, and Margaret, her mom. Margaret was different. She was in her 50s, divorced, and always had this spark, like she didn't care what anyone thought. She'd show up with a bottle of cheap wine, wearing bright lipstick, and crack jokes that made everyone laugh. I liked her, always had, but that day, I saw her differently. She was flipping burgers, her hair tied back, laughing at something Todd said. I watched her, and something shifted. Maybe it was the beer, maybe it was the anger, but I thought, why not? If Elise could do whatever she wanted, so could I. I walked over, my hands sweaty, and said, "Need help with those burgers?" She looked up, her eyes sharp, like she could see right through me. "Daniel," she said, grinning. "You offering to help, or just looking for an excuse to talk to me?" I laughed, awkward, but she didn't let it go. "You've been quiet today," she said, flipping a burger. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, then said, "Not really. Marriage stuff." I didn't want to spill it all, But she nodded, like she knew. Marriage is messy, she said, handing me a spatula. But you're a good guy. Don't let it break you. Her words hit me, soft but heavy. I looked at her, really looked, and saw something I hadn't before. She was confident, carefree, the opposite of me. And maybe that's why I said it. You know, I said, my voice low, I've always liked a woman who can handle a grill. She raised an eyebrow, then laughed, loud and bright. Careful, Daniel, she said, leaning closer. I've always liked a man who can balance a checkbook. It was a joke, but it wasn't. I felt my face heat up, my heart racing. We kept talking, joking, and it felt good. Too good. By the end of the night, we'd shared a bottle of her cheap Merlot, and I was laughing more than I had in weeks. But then it happened. I leaned in, clumsy, and kissed her. She kissed me back, and for a second, I forgot everything. Leo, Elise, the cracks in my marriage. But then I tripped over her cat, stumbling into the patio table, and we both laughed, awkward and loud. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. It was spite, pure and simple. But the next day, Margaret texted me. Coffee, she wrote, and I said yes. We met at a diner, the kind with sticky tables and bad coffee, and we talked. Not about Elise, not about the kiss, but about everything else. She told me about her divorce, how it broke her, but also freed her. I told her about my job, my fears, and she listened, really listened. It wasn't just spite anymore. It was something else, something I didn't expect. That night, Elise came home late, her hair messy. She saw me on the couch, Margaret's number still on my phone, and asked, "Where were you today?" I didn't answer, just looked at her, and she knew. Her face changed, shock, then anger. "You're kidding me," she said, her voice rising. My mom? My mom. I stood up, my hands clenched. "You opened this door, Elise," I said, echoing her words. "You don't get to close it now." She stared at me, tears in her eyes, then stormed out, slamming the door. Margaret, who had been in the kitchen all this while after she insisted coming home with me, came out, her face calm but sad. "You okay?" she asked, and I shook my head. "I don't know," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know what I'm doing." She sat next to me, her hand on my shoulder, and we sat there, silent. I felt free, but also lost. I'd made a choice, a spiteful one, but it wasn't just spite anymore. It was something deeper, and I didn't know if I was ready for it. All I knew was that our house, the one I'd thought was solid, was cracking wider, and I didn't know how to stop it. I thought I'd feel better after that night with Margaret. I thought kissing her, talking to her, would fill the hole Elise had left in me. But it didn't. It just made everything messier. I'd wake up with this heavy weight on my chest, like I'd swallowed a rock, and I couldn't shake it. I'd see Elise in the kitchen, pouring coffee, and I'd want to scream at her, ask her why she'd done this to us. But I didn't. I just grabbed my keys and left for work, pretending I had somewhere to be. Pretending I wasn't falling apart. Work was a blur. I'd stare at my computer, numbers swimming on the screen, but all I could think about was Elise and Leo. I'd imagine them laughing, touching, and it made me sick. I'd check my phone, hoping for a text from her, something to prove she still cared. But there was nothing. Just silence. And then, one day, I got home early, and she wasn't there. Her car was gone, her purse missing. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty living room, and I knew. She was with him. Again. That night, she came back late, her hair messy, her eyes red. I was on the couch, a beer in my hand, the TV on but muted. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice flat, like I didn't care. But I did. I cared too much. She froze, her hand on the doorframe. "Out," she said, avoiding my eyes. "With Leo." I laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was sharp, bitter, like glass in my throat. "Of course," I said, setting the beer down. "How's he doing? Still painting nudes or whatever?" She flinched, and for a second, I felt bad. But then she straightened, her jaw tight. "You don't get to judge me, Daniel," she said, her voice shaking. "You're the one who kissed my mom." I stood up, my hands clenched. "Yeah, because you opened this door, Elise," I said, my voice rising. "You don't get to act like the victim here." She stared at me, tears in her eyes, then turned and walked away, slamming the bedroom door. I stood there, breathing hard, my head spinning. I wanted to follow her, to fix it, but I didn't. I just sat back down, grabbed my beer, and drank until the room blurred. I didn't know how to fix us. I didn't even know if I wanted to. A few days later, everything changed. I came home from work, my tie loose, my head pounding, and found Elise on the couch, curled up with a pint of ice cream. Her eyes were puffy, her nose red, like she'd been crying for hours. I stopped, my bag still in my hand. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice softer than I meant it to be. She looked up, her face a mess of tears and mascara. "Leo's gone," she said, her voice breaking. "He dumped me. Said I was too heavy, too much baggage." I stared at her, and for a second, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Good, I thought. Let her hurt like I hurt. But then I saw her, really saw her, and the satisfaction vanished. She looked small, broken, like the woman I'd married, but also someone I didn't recognize. "I'm sorry," I said, but it came out flat, like I didn't mean it. And maybe I didn't. She shook her head, scooping more ice cream. "I thought this would be freeing," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought I'd feel alive. But I don't. I feel empty." I sat down, not next to her, but across the room, like there was a wall between us. "You wanted this, Elise," I said, my voice quiet. "You wanted freedom." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "I was wrong," she said, setting the ice cream down. "I made a mistake. I want to go back. I want us to be us again." I stared at her, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to rewind, erase Leo, erase Margaret, and go back to that diner on our road trip, laughing over sticky tables. But I couldn't. I remembered her promise, years ago, in that diner. "I'll always choose you," she'd said, her hand in mine. Now, that promise felt like a lie. "No," I said, my voice steady, colder than I meant it to be. "You opened the door, and now it stays open. Forever." Her face crumpled, tears spilling over. "Daniel, please," she said, reaching for me. "I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I'll be faithful. Just please." I stood up, my hands shaking. "You don't get it," I said, my voice rising. "You broke us. You broke me. And now you want to fix it like it's nothing." I grabbed Margaret's cheap Merlot from the counter, poured myself a glass, and walked away, leaving her sobbing on the couch. I went to the kitchen, the glass cold in my hand, and drank. The wine tasted bitter, like regret, but I kept drinking. I thought about that night at the barbecue, kissing Margaret, and how it had felt, free, but also wrong. I thought about Elise, crying in the living room, and how I'd wanted to hurt her, just like she'd hurt me. But now, seeing her like that, I didn't feel better. I felt worse. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through texts from Margaret. "Coffee tomorrow," she'd written, and I'd said yes. I didn't know why. Maybe because she listened, maybe because she made me laugh, maybe because I needed something to hold on to. But sitting there, with Elise's sobs echoing through the house, I wondered if I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. I remembered that diner again, Elise's laugh, her promise. "I'll always choose you," she'd said, and I believed her. Now, I didn't know if I believed in anything. I finished the wine, set the glass down, and stared at the empty kitchen. Our house was cracking wider, and I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know if I wanted to. I thought the worst was over. Elise had begged me to close the marriage, and I'd said no. I thought that was it, the line drawn, the fight done. But I was wrong. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about everyone, her family, my choices, the mess we'd made. And that mess? It was about to explode, right in the middle of a backyard full of burgers and bad decisions. Elise didn't talk to me for days after that night. She'd walk past me in the kitchen, her eyes red, her jaw tight, like I was a stranger. I'd try to say something, "Good morning," maybe, or pass the salt, but she'd ignore me, her silence louder than any scream. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I was free now, free to do whatever I wanted. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like falling, and I didn't know where I'd land. Margaret kept texting me. "Coffee," she'd write, or "need a break from the chaos?" I'd say yes, every time, because with her, I could breathe. We'd meet at that diner, the one with the sticky tables and bad coffee, and we'd talk. Not about Elise, not about the kiss, but about everything else. She'd tell me stories, her divorce, her wild years, the time she hitchhiked across the state with nothing but a backpack and a bottle of wine. I'd laugh, and it felt good, like I was someone else, someone lighter. But then I'd go home, and Elise would be there, her silence cutting me like a knife, and I'd remember. I wasn't someone else. I was still me, still stuck. Elise started rallying her family against me. I didn't notice at first, but then I got a call from Claire, her sister. "What the hell, Daniel?" she said, her voice sharp. "You're sleeping with my mom? Are you serious?" I tried to explain, but she cut me off. "You're disgusting," she said, and hung up. I sat there, my phone still in my hand, feeling like I'd been slapped. Todd, her brother, was different. He texted me, "Yo, dude, you're wild." Mom, though? Respect. I didn't know if he was joking or not, but it didn't help. It just made me feel worse. Then came the cousin's wedding. Elise insisted I go, saying, "It's family, Daniel. You can't just skip it." I didn't want to, but Margaret texted me, "I'll be there. Bring your dancing shoes." I thought, why not? If Elise could parade Leo around, I could show up with Margaret. So I did. I wore my best suit, the one Elise used to love, and met Margaret at the venue. She looked good, bright lipstick, a flowy dress, that spark in her eyes. "Ready to cause some trouble?" she said, grinning, and I laughed, nervous but excited. The wedding was chaos from the start. Elise was there, in a blue dress, her eyes darting between me and Margaret. Claire glared at me from across the room, whispering to her cousins. Todd was high, laughing too loud, and I felt like everyone was watching us. Margaret didn't care. She grabbed my hand, pulled me to the dance floor, and we started slow dancing to Sweet Caroline. I tried to focus on her, on the music, but I could feel Elise's eyes burning into me. And then it happened. A bread roll flew past my head, hitting the wall behind me. I turned, and there was Elise, her face red, her hand shaking. "You're disgusting," she yelled, loud enough for everyone to hear. The music stopped, and the room went silent. Margaret laughed, loud and bright. "Relax, honey," she said, stepping forward. "You open this door. Don't act surprised when we walk through it." Elise stared at her, tears in her eyes. "You're my mom," she said, her voice breaking. "How could you do this?" Margaret softened, just for a second. "I'm lonely, too, Elise," she said, her voice quiet. "You pushed us here. All of us." The room stayed silent, everyone watching, waiting. Elise turned and ran out, Claire following her. Todd clapped, slow and sarcastic. "Drama of the year," he said, and I wanted to disappear. Margaret took my hand, pulled me aside. "You okay?" she asked, and I shook my head. "I don't know," I said, my voice raw. "I don't know what I'm doing." Family gatherings after that were worse. Every dinner, every barbecue was a battleground. Claire wouldn't look at me. Todd kept calling me Dad, and Elise would sit there, silent, her eyes red. Margaret tried to keep things light, cracking jokes, pouring wine, but it didn't help. The tension was thick, like smoke, and I felt like I was choking on it. I started avoiding them, staying late at work, but Margaret wouldn't let me hide. "You can't run from this," she said one day, over coffee. "You made a choice. Own it." I didn't know if I wanted to own it. I didn't know if I wanted to be this person, the guy who kissed his wife's mom, the guy who broke his family. So I did something I'd never done before. I started therapy. My first session was awkward. The therapist, a woman with glasses and a calm voice, asked, "Why are you here?" I didn't know where to start, but I tried. I told her about Elise, about Leo, about Margaret. I told her about the cracks in our house, the ones I couldn't fix. She listened, nodding, and when I finished, she said, "You're angry, Daniel. But you're also lost. Let's start there." I left that session feeling raw, like I'd peeled back a layer of skin. But I also felt something else, hope, maybe, or at least a flicker of it. I started thinking about our marriage, really thinking. I remembered the early days, the good ones, like that road trip to the coast. But I also remembered the fights, the silences, the times I'd ignored her restlessness. Maybe our house wasn't as solid as I'd thought. Maybe the cracks were there all along, and I just didn't see them. That night, I walked home, the air cold, my breath visible. I passed Elise on the street, coming back from somewhere, her coat pulled tight. We stopped, just for a second, and looked at each other. Her eyes were tired, sad, like mine. "Hey," I said, my voice soft. She nodded, but didn't say anything. We stood there, the silence heavy, and then she walked away, disappearing into the dark. I watched her go and wondered if we'd ever find our way back. or if we were too far gone. I kept going to therapy week after week, sitting in that small office with the calm-voiced therapist and her glasses that caught the light. It felt strange at first, talking about myself like that, peeling back layers I'd kept buried for years. But it helped, in a way. It made me see things I hadn't before. Like how I'd always thought our marriage was solid, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe the cracks were there all along, and I just ignored them, hoping they'd fix themselves. Therapy didn't fix me, but it made me ask questions. Hard ones. Like, who was I without Elise? And did I even want to find out? Elise, though, she was falling apart. I'd see her in the house, moving like a ghost, her eyes red, her hair unwashed. She'd stopped going to work, stopped answering calls. I'd find her on the couch, staring at the TV, some reality show blaring, but she wasn't watching. She was just there, empty. I wanted to feel bad for her, and I did. Sometimes. But then I'd remember Leo, her promises, the way she looked at me like I wasn't enough, and the anger would come back, hot and sharp. I'd leave the room, grab my jacket, and go to Margaret's. Because with Margaret, I could breathe. With Elise, I was drowning. One day, I came home, and she wasn't on the couch. The TV was off, the house quiet, but her car was still outside. I found her in the bedroom, sitting on the bed, a notebook in her lap. She looked up, her eyes tired but clearer, like she'd woken up from a long sleep. I started therapy, she said, her voice soft. And I joined a support group. For people like me, trying to figure out open relationships. I stood there, my bag still in my hand, not sure what to say. That's good, I said finally, because it was. But it didn't change anything. Not for me. I'm glad you're getting help. She nodded, setting the notebook down. I've been thinking, she said, her voice shaking. About us. About why I did this. I was scared, Daniel. Scared of being stuck, of losing myself. But I lost you instead. I looked at her, and for a second, I saw the woman I'd married. The one who'd laughed with me in that diner, who'd promised to always choose me. But then I remembered the rest. Leo, Margaret, the bread roll at the wedding, Todd calling me dad. It was too much. You can't fix this, Elise, I said, my voice steady. You can't just say sorry and make it okay. She stood up, stepping closer. I know, she said, tears in her eyes. I know I hurt you, but I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. I want to rebuild, not as your wife, but as someone who cares. Someone who's sorry. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach out, hold her, tell her we could try. But I couldn't. I stepped back, my hands clenched. I need time, I said, my voice breaking. I need space. She nodded, wiping her tears. Okay, she said, her voice small. I'll give you that. She walked past me, her shoulder brushing mine, and I felt the weight of her leaving, like a door closing. I sat on the bed, her notebook still there, and flipped it open. It was full of messy handwriting, pages of thoughts, regrets. I read one line. I thought freedom would save me, but it broke us. I closed it, my chest tight, and wondered if she'd ever find her way back, or if I even wanted her to. Margaret kept being there, steady, like an anchor. We'd meet at the diner, talk over bad coffee, and I'd feel lighter. But I started noticing things, like how she'd laugh too loud, like she was trying to fill the silence, or how she'd avoid talking about Elise, like she knew it was a landmine. I started wondering if this, us, was real, or just a rebound, a way to escape the pain. Therapy made me ask those questions, too. What do you want, Daniel? My therapist asked one day, her pen tapping her notepad. I didn't know. I didn't know if I wanted Margaret or Elise or neither. All I knew was that I didn't want to hurt anymore. Months passed, and I kept going to therapy, kept seeing Margaret, kept avoiding Elise. But the weight didn't lift. It got heavier, like a storm building inside me. I started looking at apartments, scrolling through listings late at night, imagining a life alone. It scared me, but it also felt right. Like maybe I needed to start over, not with someone else, but with myself. One day, I made the decision. I called Elise, asked her to meet me at a coffee shop, the one we used to go to before everything fell apart. She showed up, her hair pulled back, her eyes nervous. I ordered us coffee, black for me, sugar for her, and we sat there, the silence heavy. I want a divorce, I said, my voice steady, but my hands shaking under the table. I can't do this anymore. She looked at me, tears in her eyes, but she didn't argue. Okay, she said, her voice small. I understand. We talked about the details, splitting stuff, signing papers, and it felt so clinical, so final. But then she reached for my hand, just for a second, and said, I'm sorry, Daniel, for everything. I nodded, pulling my hand back, and we sat there, the coffee cooling, the silence stretching. I left the coffee shop, the air cold, my breath visible. I walked home, passing our usual old diner. I stopped, looking through the window, and saw a couple laughing, their hands linked. I remembered us, that night, her promise. I'll always choose you, she'd said, and I believed her. Now, I didn't know if I believed in anything. I kept walking, the diner fading behind me, and I felt the weight of our marriage lifting, but also the weight of what came next. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday in a quiet office. Elise was there, sitting across from me, her hands folded tight in her lap. She wore a gray sweater, her hair pulled back, and I noticed how tired she looked, like the weight of everything had settled into her bones. I felt it, too, that weight. It wasn't anger anymore, not like before. It was something quieter, heavier, like a shadow we couldn't shake. We didn't talk much, just signed where the lawyer pointed, and then it was done. For years, gone, just like that. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and for a second, I thought she might say something. But she didn't. She just nodded, stood up, and left, her footsteps echoing in the hall. I sat there, the pen still in my hand, and felt the silence settle in. I moved out the next week. Found a small apartment across town, 1 bedroom, cheap rent, a view of a parking lot. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I unpacked boxes, stacking books on a wobbly shelf, hanging a few pictures on the walls. I found an old photo of us from that road trip to the coast, smiling at the diner with sticky tables. I stared at it, remembering her laugh, her promise. I'll always choose you, she'd said, and I believed her. Now, I didn't know what to believe. I thought about throwing it away, but I didn't. I put it in a drawer, out of sight, but not gone. Not yet. I kept going to therapy week after week, sitting in that small office with the calm voice therapist. She'd ask me, "How are you feeling, Daniel?" And I'd try to answer, but it was hard. I felt everything, relief, guilt, loneliness, hope, all mixed together, like a storm I couldn't escape. But therapy helped in its own way. It made me see things I hadn't before. Like how I'd always thought love was about holding on, but maybe it was about letting go. Letting go of Elise, letting go of the life I'd thought we'd have. It scared me, that idea, but it also felt right. Like maybe I needed to start over, not with someone else, but with myself. Margaret was still there, steady, like she always was. We'd meet at the diner, talk over bad coffee, and I'd feel lighter. But I started pulling back, not because I didn't care, but because I needed space. I'd see her laugh, her bright lipstick flashing, and I'd wonder if this, us, was real, or just a rebound, a way to fill the hole Elise had left. I told her one night, over dinner at her place, the wine glasses half empty. "I need time," I said, my voice quiet. "I don't know what I want, but I need to figure it out." She nodded, her eyes soft, like she understood. "Take all the time you need," she said, her hand brushing mine. "I'm not going anywhere." I smiled, but it was small, tired. I didn't know if I wanted her to stay, or if I wanted to be alone. All I knew was that I needed to find out. Elise, though, she was moving forward, too. I'd hear things, from Todd, from Claire, bits and pieces of her life. She'd started writing, filling notebooks with her thoughts, her regrets. Todd told me she was working on a memoir called Open Wounds, and I laughed, bitter, when I heard the title. "Fitting," I said, and he nodded, his eyes red from smoking. "She's trying, man," he said, his voice soft. "She's messed up, but she's trying." I didn't know if I cared, but I did, a little. I wanted her to be okay, even if we weren't. The family event came a month later, a barbecue at Margaret's place, burgers on the grill, music blaring. I didn't want to go, but Todd texted me, "Come on, Dad, don't be a stranger." I laughed, despite myself, and went. I wore a plain shirt, jeans, nothing special, and walked into the backyard, the smell of smoke and meat hitting me. Margaret was there, flipping burgers, her laugh loud and bright. Todd was high, Claire was quiet, and then I saw her. Elise, sitting at the long table, a glass of water in her hand. She looked up, saw me, and froze. I froze, too, my heart pounding, but then I nodded, and she nodded back, and we sat down, across from each other, the table between us. The chatter was loud, relatives laughing, kids running, but it felt distant, like we were in our own bubble. She adjusted her scarf, her eyes softer than I'd seen in months. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the noise. "For everything." I looked at her, and for a second, I saw the woman I'd married, the one who'd laughed with me in that diner. But then I saw the rest: Leo, Margaret, the bread roll, the silence. "Me too," I said, my voice calm but tired. "But we're here, aren't we?" Still standing. She smiled, small, sad, and nodded. Margaret caught my eye, offered a supportive nod, her presence a reminder of the messy path I'd taken to this moment. The room buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, but we sat there, in our own quiet space, two people who had loved, lost, and learned. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I felt it, the weight lifting, just a little. Not gone, but lighter, like maybe we could carry it now. I left that night, the air cold, my breath visible. I walked home, passing the diner, the one with the sticky tables. I stopped, looking through the window, and saw a couple laughing, their hands linked. I remembered us, that night, her promise. "I'll always choose you," she'd said, and I believed her. Now, I didn't know if I believed in anything, but I knew I believed in this, in surviving and starting over and finding my way. I kept walking, the diner fading behind me, and I felt the cracks in our house closing, not fixed, but healing. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I'd be okay. And that's it, I guess. Our story, laid out, cracks and all. Walking away from that diner, feeling those cracks start to heal, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And maybe that's what matters, finding your way, even when it hurts, even when you're not sure where you'll end up. I don't know if you've been there, stuck in a mess you didn't see coming, wondering if you'll ever be okay again. Maybe you're there now, listening to this, feeling that weight. If you are, I hope you found something here, something that helps, even just a little. If this story hit you, if it made you think, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below, tell me what you felt, what you've been through, or just say hi. It means a lot, knowing I'm not alone, and maybe you're not either. And if you like this, hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this, stories that matter. Subscribe, too, if you want. There's more coming, more stories about love, loss, and finding your way back. Stick around. We're all just trying to figure it out, one step at a time. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.